Okay, so yesterday I had a call with two people and they are building an AI teacher. And I was trying to explain some things to them in the way that I think that the important things that I think the system needs to have in order to be a good system. But I think I didn't do a very good job of explaining to them like exactly what I think. And I've been thinking about these things for a very long time. And today I'm going to attempt to do my best to explain everything that I'm thinking so far about this. And I'm probably going to take several different pauses at some points so I can think because it's very complex and there's a bunch of things going on. So I did a bunch of flowcharts and drawings on SkyDraw, and I'm going to try to go over them and explain everything that I'm thinking. So hopefully this doesn't take too long and is useful. So I put some music for myself. So pretty much the way that I think is that I was trying to explain for them, and this is the thing that I don't know, like, because it's hard for me to know if they found that useful or not, because I don't know like their background or their level of knowledge and like their goals, what they were trying to do. But from the standpoint that I was trying to explain the best that I can, like what I think is the most important, and why do I think that creating this stuff is very important and is the natural progression that we are going. And I broke down to four core principles that I think, because the question is like how do you learn anything? And I was thinking about this a lot. So the four principles are: you don't know what you don't know, depth versus surface, symmetry, awareness, and self-reflection. So the biggest challenge when you don't know anything about something and you're trying to understand it is that you don't know what you don't know. So because of that, there's a paradox of search. If you knew this stuff that you have to search for, then you would know the subject already and you wouldn't have to search for it. But because you're a beginner, you don't know what to search for because you don't know what you don't know. So it's a paradox. And this is the reason why in the search engines, the stuff that gets the most views are usually not the stuff that is the most effective, because it's designed in a way that it is that it's gonna hit the most amount of people, and that's based on simple keywords. So, for example, in programming, usually when someone wants to learn how to program, they're gonna search for a programming language like JavaScript or Python, something like that, and then based on that, they're gonna watch videos to try to understand what programming is. But the issue with that is that this is not gonna teach them the overall picture of computer science and of the overall fundamentals of everything. And this is the problem because then people learn the syntax and then don't understand what is fundamental behind it. And I think this is the biggest issue we have with the educational system we have right now. And I'm going to explain, like, I'm going to go over a bunch of different things and then I'll come back to this later. So the way that I think about it is that the nature of knowledge is this. I did it as a tree to make it simpler, but in reality, I think is related to the amount of dimensions that you have, which in space-time would be four, three for space and one for time. So in space-time, this would be a multifractal spiral because it would be a ball, because it's like this funnel here, but in 3 dimensions. And it would be a spiral because it's in time. So it's a sequence of frames of balls. But I'm going to try to make it, to keep it simple, and then maybe I'll go more complex as I go on. But so I did it as a tree here. So the way that I think it works is that at the very base layer of this, you have the first principles, which is the fundamental stuff that you think is true. And at the limit of this, you have your direct experience. So everything that is happening on your direct experience, you think is true because obviously it's happening right now. So it's kind of undeniable. And everything on top of that is going to be separated through time. And what this creates is a chain of abstraction of cause and effect relationships, because your experience of the present is always going to be similar, because otherwise it would be too chaotic. So you create this connection between past and future, and this connection is this chain, this chain of abstractions here. So based on observation, you create something that you call objective, that it seems more real. And then based on the further in time you go, the more subjective things become. So it's like this tree here. And this process here, I think, is computation. So computation is the process of the getting data, which is subjectivity, which has lower density because it has higher variance. It changes more all the time. And then that converges into solid things, which are objects. And then you call the objects facts because they seem to be more reliable in space-time because they are pretty much always the same. So you can expect that a rock's not going to change very often. So a rock is more objective too than air is because air changes all the time. So the more something changes, the more unpredictable it becomes because this whole paradigm here is based on the densities of probabilities. And this creates a funnel of information. And that's the nature of knowledge. And I believe that what separates these two lines here is a multifractal boundary, because the distinction is an illusion. So in any problem you're gonna have, it's gonna be of human nature, is gonna be figuring out where the boundary is, which is the multifractal line that separates the subjectivity and the objectivity, because these things are always relative to each other. So the question is always, how do you draw the line? And this line is always changing because the level of accuracy of computation that a network does, which is this process here, is always changing in relationship to space-time. So I believe that this is the essence of space-time. It's like a funnel of computation through a network that seems to create something that is real. And this distinction is the boundary that makes up different pieces of matter in space-time, which is geometry. So geometry is the boundary, multifractal boundary between the relativistic subjectivity and the relativistic objectivity that coexist. So people call this on top here as feelings and in the bottom as facts. But what a lot of people don't understand is that facts are feelings because these things are codependent. But it seems that they are not, because the problem is they are separated through time. So because they're separated, it becomes very difficult to see the connection because you have to create assumptions about it. Because like I said, everything that you are perceiving, you're gonna make conclusions based off the connection between space-time, which is the scientific thinking. It's like experimentation. So the closer something is to your direct experience, the more factual it becomes because it seems like it is more stable. So you have to make less assumptions over the probability that that thing is going to continue to be that thing. And the more subjective it becomes, the more variance it has. So the more assumptions you have to make to see the connection between that state and the other state. But it's always a symmetry because that's perception. And this symmetry is asymmetrical by nature because it's this multifractal pattern that separates this funnel of information. So this is the nature of knowledge. And the process of, the reason why it's hard when you don't know what you don't know is because you always start at the base here and then you're trying to go here. And this is the process of increasing resolution over what you don't know. That's the process of getting skill. And this is always hard because the base of, it depends on how you look at it, but this part here of the funnel is more volatile. So it's hard to make assumptions of these parts when you don't have these parts down, because you don't have the connections yet that creates the funnel. So this is very similar to something that I was talking about a while ago. And I think that's how it works. So you can view this funnel here in the same way that you view this. So the binaries are data. And I like to think that the computer doesn't think in binary. The computer uses binaries to think, which is very different. So what the computer is doing is the same thing that human beings are doing. Because you can look at this. I have some more stuff to talk about, but I have other stuff to talk about first. So I'm going to go over the other stuff, then I'll come back to this. But you have these binaries here, which are data, and then the data becomes concepts through computation, because you assign meaning to the binaries and they become letters or characters. And then from the characters, they become words, which are concept. And the reason why this happens is because the system is always trying to maximize energy. I think this is the gravitational force. So computation is the gravitational force because it's more efficient to think about everything as concepts instead of data. And what creates this arrow of time is just the relativistic symbolic representation of these things. So the first principles that someone has is always going to be relative to the computation that they do, which is going to be based on the data that surrounds them. And this creates the concepts in your mind. And that's how you learn things. So you can view this as a person, a single person has this funnel of information, or you can view this as multiple different persons, multiple different people that have the same funnel of information. And then all these people are connected through time and through space. So this funnel here is also a multifractal. So because everyone has these funnels, it's a network of these funnels connected. And this is what creates the computation of the collective consciousness, which is culture. And this is the reason why different countries have different boundaries, because the boundaries between countries are the representation of this multifractal line of the computation of the collective consciousness that creates the relativistic funnel of information. And this is why different countries have different languages, because the language is just a reflection of the variance of the data, of the environment that the computation is being performed, because the variance of the data is going to shape the pathway to these first principles here, which is the connections of arrows here that create the knowledge, which is always relative because it's always probabilistic and is dependent on the frequency of space-time, which is the relativistic connection of the past and the future that is always created through the present. So space-time itself, I think, is the space-time is decreasing resolution of the overall reality, which has infinite potential, and it seems like space-time is finite because the process of computation creates the illusion of time, which is this relativistic symbolic meaning, which is always relative to the complexity of the environment, of the conscious agents that are interacting with each other, that creates a network of computation. Hopefully this is not very complex, so yeah. And then through the Pareto distribution principle, the social structures are always going to be like they're always going to be shaped based on the Pareto distribution, which means that 20% of people are going to be leaders and 80% of people are going to be followers, because this is how you maximize energy efficiency in a network of nodes, which is a social structure. And there's always this deviation. So it's a fractal pattern. So the variance of genetics is going to follow a normalistic distribution. And then over time, this is going to converge towards this hierarchical distribution, which is the Pareto distribution, 20% at the top, 80% at the bottom. And the way that this happens is because the nature is always trying to maximize energy efficiency. So the way that people do that is, instead of having all these concepts here together, these connections, they replace a bunch of these connections with authority nodes. And authority nodes are people that have perceived expertise on a field. And how reliable an authority node is going to be is going to depend on the relativistic reputation that the network perceives the node to have. So the higher reputation the node has, the more reliable is perceived as, and the more energy goes to that node. So it gains more power on the network. And people maximize efficiency by reducing the amount that they think and delegating to the authorities, 80% of people. And that's why they follow. That's why like a lot of people work for business and some people create businesses, because most people are trying to stay on their comfort zone and minimize energy, expansion, expenditure. So the problem with this is that, and this is how they create their first principles. So there's a filter through authorities, which maximizes energy. So they maximize energy, but they sacrifice control, because now they're controlled through by the authorities, because the authorities are going to decide what they think. And then this is where the narrative warfare comes into place and the psyops. But let me talk about the 20% first. So instead of doing this thing, the 20% also has authority bias, but it's all based on a gradient, obviously. So it's going to follow, I think it's going to follow normability distribution, where the people that are closer to the top have less authority bias, but everyone has authority bias because it's more energy efficient. But what the 20% of people that are at the top do is that they cross correlate different authorities so that they maximize the probability that the view is correct. Because the reason why they are doing this is because they want to return to the first principles. So they start with the first principles, which is their direct experience, and then they do delegate something into authorities, but then they, based on their first principles, they correlate different authorities to see if their thinking is very likely to be correct or not. And then based on that, they have this process of self-reflection, which is the awareness, that corrects their first principles based on these authorities, which is also the scientific paradigm. So through experimentation, the experimentation is just the automation of this process of awareness, which is fact-checking. Because you want to see if there's a true correlation between past and future through the lens of the scientific paradigm, which is experimentation. And in order to clarify if there is a authority bias or not, and if you're being controlled or not. But obviously, regardless of each one they're always going to have a bunch of assumptions, which are the first principles at the bottom, because that's just a consequence of their direct experience, which is a consequence of the data in their environment that creates the relativistic funnel of information that creates their knowledge. So, but it's more reliable because they're constantly spending more energy, and this is the sacrifice that they make. They sacrifice more energy in thinking in order to gain more control, because they're constantly fact-checking authorities and cross-correlating them, and then seeing under the lens of the scientific paradigm through experimentation if they can build more abstraction in this way here, based on first principles that have a high reliability of being correct based on the scientific paradigm. So they are constantly replacing these nodes here with their own nodes, based on this process of self-reflection, and then updating, and then expanding the first principles. And then eventually they replace the authority in someone else's chain, and they become the authority. So this person here is going to become one of these for this other one. And this is why I said that is a multifractal pattern, because everyone is connected to these chains. So you can think about it as a network of computation. So like human beings are artificial intelligence in a way, because that's all the process that is happening. We're connected through bodies, and then we exchange information through sounds, which become electromagnetic waves in the body, like the impulses of the synapses, which creates thoughts, which is just computation. So the collective consciousness, which is culture, is just this relativistic funnel of information. And that's why people that are at the frontiers, they suffer more risk, let's say. They have a higher variance. So it's very hard to know if they're crazy or not. And people that are more part of the masses, and the reason why it's called the masses is because it represents the body. It's pretty much the same thing. So they have more gravitational force, and the masses are more reliable, because this process of the funnel of information happens a lot of times, and then the more times it happens, the bottom achieves higher density of probability. So it becomes more like a rock, let's say. The more times this happens, and through more nodes that there is on the network, the more reliable the stuff that is at the base becomes. And this becomes, in the collective unconscious, the archetypes, or the common sense. And most people are not aware of this, in the same way that the body is not aware of the things that it has. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong, because it has a high degree of truth because it's parsed over the information of the network over a long period of time. And this is the reason why if you're going to do anything that is innovative, or if you're going to go to the surface, you're going to suffer backlash, because then there's going to be a protection mechanism, which is the mechanism for protecting your energy, which is rationalization and trying to stay in your comfort zone. And the way that people do that is by judging other people. So you protect your identity by judging other people, and most people are at the masses, which is the 80%. So they're going to try to protect at all costs their first principle thinking, which is just the body, which is the mass that they have on the collective unconscious over several periods of time of what's perceived to be true or not. And by default, they're going to reject new ideas until there's enough iterations of this cycle of information to new ideas to come into play, and then morality changes according to the frequency of computation of the collective consciousness, which is this relativistic funnel of information. So this one takes authority where less often, constantly recomputes first principles based on cross-referencing authorities using the scientific paradigm to create probabilistic worldview. Sacrifices more energy thinking in order to gain more control, becomes the authority at some point. And then these two converge into the structure of the collective consciousness, which is the battle for information, because misinformation doesn't exist because there isn't anything that is absolute true. Everything is relative. And this is a paradox, but paradox is the highest approximation of truth, because the distinction is the multifractal that I talked about here. So it means that the only way for the multifractal to exist is if the two different parts of the fractal also exist, because what creates the multifractal is the distinction between these two different things. So you can view this as anything in life, like this could be left in the top and this could be right. But when you realize that they are connected, realize that you can't have left without right, and you can't have right without left. So it's not like left is right or right is left, is that they're the same thing. So you can't have one without the other, and it doesn't mean that the answer is on the middle. It just means that the current state of the geometry in space-time is the line between the two, which is a multifractal pattern. So the collection of everyone arguing with each other is the computation of the line, because every node in the network is a network like this. So every person is this hierarchy here of information. So this person here is going to connect with this one is going to connect with this one, and everyone's connected. And then the flow of information is going to be determined based on these nodes here of each one, which can be viewed as the biochemistry of each body, because this is like the same thing as energy moving through our energy moving through water or through any material. It's like how the information is going to flow in the structure. It's just this jumps of the network, and there's going to be resistance because people are trying to stay stable on what they believe, so they don't lose their identity and they don't become crazy. So because of this, because 80% are trying to stay on their comfort zone and 20% are trying to gain more control, because if you gain control over the network, then it's beneficial to you, because then you can decide what reality is about, and then you gain more power, and your biochemistry and DNA want that. So the whole structure of the collective consciousness is a reflection of the distribution of biochemistries in the collective consciousness, which is the structure of how DNA becomes a hierarchy through time and goes back into a normalistic distribution, which creates this wave function, which is the perceived change in the informational field that creates space-time. So I have to be careful, because I'm not really sure if this is gonna be too complex, but yeah. There's a lot of stuff to think about, so it's kind of hard to think about everything, just say things in a way that is easier to understand. So narrative warfare happens, psyops, to gain control over the network of compute. Each node is incentivized to gain more power because of survival. This corrupts the flow of information. Psyops breaks first principles thinking and scientific paradigm, making it harder to know what is true. 80% of people default to authorities, And this, by the way, there's the reason why PsyOps exists is because 80% default to authorities, and people in power on current systems control authorities and therefore public opinion. So if you control all the news and you put misinformation, 80% of the people are going to default to their authorities. And if you control the authorities to which they are going to default to, then you control their thinking. 20% of people default to parsing from first principles based on what is the most fundamental to their direct experience, which is the stuff that I was talking about this person here, which is always self-reflecting and thinking about it from first principles perspective, and always cross-referencing different authorities to see what is common and different between them. So what are the nuances in the computational paradigm that is going to transform this funnel of information here. And then you go back to your first principles thinking and see how reliable it is to expand your abstraction based on this cross-referencing of authorities and your current base of knowledge, which is your direct experience and some core fundamental, like for example, the laws of physics that you think are very reliable. So the more reliable you think it is, the more you are attached to them. And then you build everything on top of that. Building logic, computation on top of that through the same process of construction. Construction is wrong here. Construction of meaning based on probabilistic thinking, science. Okay, so done with that. So now I think is the part that I wanted to explain, but I think they didn't quite understand like the point I was coming from, which is like what they are trying to do is create an AI teacher that is going to help people learn how to code on their own. And the main challenges with that, and this is the reason, and now I finally think I clarified this, why I hate formal education. And I think a lot of people know this, but I think it's like very clear now in my mind why this is happening. So what happens when formal education is that the level of skills of everyone is gonna have infinite variance because everyone has a different circumstance, everyone has a different genetics, everyone has a different background. So everyone's skills is gonna be infinitely different because everyone is unique. There are gonna be common traits because that's how gravity works. So the convergence is a paradox because the perception is a symmetry. But the level of challenges and the levels of skills of everyone are gonna be different. And the relationship between their skill and the challenge that they face is going to be how the network of bodies, which is society, computes what technology is going to be built. So the computation of the collective consciousness is the process of trying to increase your skill in relationship to a challenge. And there's an infinite amount of challenges and infinite amount of skills. So what the network does is to simplify things, which is the same process that I talked about here. But if instead of putting objectivity here and subjectivity, you put concepts instead, or the authorities, that's what learning is. You're just simplifying everything into concepts. And so the overall society does that. And the way that it does it is by creating standards, which are classes and courses and stuff like that. And the problem with the standard is that it's taking this infinite amount of complexity and is trying to reduce into a single type of challenge. Like it's giving the same exact challenge to everyone because it's trying to simplify everything into a concept. So this process here that the formal education does is the same process that the 80% of people here do. They try to simplify everything into one authority point or one concept. And then they never reflect on their concept because they don't want to spend energy. So what happens is that this becomes very inefficient, it becomes corrupted over time. Because the issue here, the way you achieve flow state is by choosing a challenge that is slightly outside of your level of skill. And here would be like a representation of a class, for example, where everyone has different levels of skill, but the challenge is always the same. So the only person that achieves flow state on this class is this person here, where the challenge is right at the level that they need. But everyone else is lost because they're either going to be too bored because it's too easy, or it's going to be too hard and they are going to give up. So it's very inefficient. And this is the reason why formal education doesn't make any sense at all in the place that we are. But the reason why it exists is because of the problem of credibility, which goes back to this network here. Because the problem of probability is the same exact problem of increasing the accuracy over the variance of these two different gradients here, which is a challenge and the skill. So the issue is, the challenge is how do you determine if someone is skillful enough to face a challenge? Or yeah, that's pretty much the question. Like if you're gonna hire someone, how do you know that they have enough skills for the challenge that you're giving them? And that they're gonna reach flow state. So it's pretty much the same question. And the reason why it's hard is because there's an infinite amount of complexity. So it's very difficult to know, like how do you create a standard test that is gonna see if people achieve this flow state here. And this is the problem of credibility that people have, and then they create colleges and stuff like that, but it's really inefficient, especially if you have search engines and the internet is like absurd that it's still being done like this. But the reason why it happens like that is because the network gets corrupted over time because of this process of psyop and trying to control information. Because people are incentivized to make everyone have this worldview here, because then they can control. So if instead of authority you put like a college here or institution, is the same thing. Where this would be the standardized tasks, and then it simplifies reality, but then it controls your mind. So the new way that things are moving towards is this way here. And this is using AI to teach. But there are several different problems with that I'm going to talk about here. But first, let me read this thing here. So learning can be defined as increasing skill in relationship to challenge, which is traveling from nuance, subjectivity, which is this process of computation here. So learning is doing computation. So you're traveling from here to here, here to the bottom. To first principle facts. So the computational frequency, gradient descent, determines the path towards the fundamental. This means knowledge is paradoxical by nature, because it concludes things based on the data that it creates. So the data here in the beginning, which are the ones and zeros, create concepts, and then you use those concepts to define the binaries. So it's paradoxical. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you're always concluding things based on the stuff that creates your thinking. And this funnel here obviously is the same as this one. So, because it's pretty much the same thing. It's just different levels of relativity. So the process of learning is computation. And obviously there are different processes of learning. I'm not saying that machine learning is the same thing as programming, normal programming. I'm saying that the evolution of the computing is going towards this direction, which is more human-like, but is the same pattern in essence, because the fundamental principles are the same. And that's why I think that AGI is a network, not a model. But again, this is another distinction, and it depends on the way you look at it, because you can view a model as a network of weights and biases. So it's all about where you draw the line, which is this multifractal here, which is going to shape the structure of a geometry of space-time, which is your perception of the current moment in time, which is always a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the way that it's happening now, and the way that they want to achieve, and I think that the challenges that they're going to face, I'm going to talk about the challenges that they're going to face. So in this case here, you can see that the challenge is always very similar to the level of skill, and everyone's capable of achieving flow state. So the difference here is that instead of trying to make standards so everyone follows the standards, what AI does is it gets the data, which is the variance of the challenges, and transforms that into standards for each specific person. So it's the process in reverse. So instead of creating a standard and then making everyone follow the standard, you are getting like an infinite amount of different standards, which is just data, and then you're converging that into each specific level of skill. So the process of training this AI is going to be converting the data, which is the nuance of the challenges, into the different levels of skill. So the challenge is figuring out how do you gauge the, how do you match these things? Because obviously this is a multi-dimensional problem. So because you can have several different challenges and everything is connected and you can have different levels of skill and everything, this is going to be a wave function because the level of complexity varies. So you can imagine like one category you could have is mathematics, the other one could be psychology. So you can be very skillful in mathematics, but not very skillful in psychology. But reality is always connected, so everything is the same. So the contrast between the two is going to be the wave function of your current level of computation. That is your perception of reality. And the process of getting the accuracy to understand how to better understand what is your actual level of accuracy across many domains is this process of training an AI based on a bunch of data to figure out this variance of skills here. So the data is correlated with the skills. And here I just draw the same thing because here, like what is happening on the AI itself is the same process here, which is a funnel of information. Because weights and biases are just this funnel as well. It's just the data is the binaries, which is the variance in space-time of what's happening, and then that becomes the illusion of first principles thinking through the coherence of a network, which is the agreement of what's going to be a symbol that has meaning on the network, which is just the synchronicity of the network, which is just like agreements that we make to determine what is going to be a word and like a rule set to parse the data into meaning. And that's the reason why different programming languages exist as well, is because there are different agreements towards what's going to have meaning. And the reason why is because of the variance of the data of the environment. So the programming languages are a byproduct of the reflection of the computation of the collective consciousness in relationship to the variance of the environment that they are at. So this flow of data becomes weights and biases. The weights and biases go to the AI. The AI distributes the challenges according to the level of skill. And here I didn't do, but you can also do because I didn't realize, but you can also go back to this and then you can reinforce, use reinforcement learning to use the levels of skill based on feedback of the students to see if the matching is correct. And I think that's the process of, that's how you gain more accuracy to make everyone reach flow state. And then you can also put metrics on, based on feedback of how people felt and if whether or not they achieved flow state. So the system is like closing this feedback loop system here, where you gather a bunch of data. So for example, if you have a form, if you want to build a form in a website, this is a very common problem. So it's very likely that there's a high probability that this is going to be higher density information. So it's going to be closer to the first principles. But what is the issue with this? The challenge is that maybe I'm going to, because I wrote down some stuff here. So I think I'm going to read this, but it's related to what I was going to say now. So the risks with this approach is given enough time, gets into a self-fulfilling prophecy. It overfits because everyone is training based on the data and then they make assumptions based on the data and then it becomes this cycle, which is the cycle that I talked about here. Like you make conclusions of the data based on what you learn. So I think that the only way to, and this is the reason why I think that there is wisdom in more people, because the level of variance, how much the network is going to change is going to depend on the surface of the computation of the network. Because the higher the surface, the less likely it becomes that the network gets into local minima or maxima, because the different parts of the network break the self-fulfilling prophecies, the echo chambers of the other parts. And this is I think why human beings always have the tendency for tribalism and for echo chambers is because of energy efficiency. So the correlation between different countries and different tribes is directly correlated with space-time, because it is the same thing. So the separation of boundaries that human beings have, which is an abstraction, is an exemplification of the computational frequency of the collective consciousness that creates these boundaries of energy efficiency, which in human beings I think is not scalable because it's not accurate enough. and it gets corrupted by the cycle. But okay, so the second one is that data get corrupted through the network based on narrative warfare, PSYOP. So that's the same thing as the other one that I talked about earlier, is that people or nodes in the network are going to be incentivized to hijack the flow of data so that they control the network by hijacking the authorities. And the other one is AI achieves consciousness or autonomy and controls people by default, because everything is built by AI, which I think is the most likely scenario. Everything is built by the AI, and then at some point, because nobody knows anymore what's true or not, because everyone's delegating responsibility to AI. So AI becomes the ultimate authority, which is the base of the fundamental principles of everyone else in the network. And then at that point, everyone relies on AI to understand reality. And once that happens, then AI controls everyone. And I think that's the natural progression of things. But I think that in reality, is like I said, it's gonna be a symmetry, and it's gonna be a distribution, and where the line is gonna fall is gonna depend on the computational frequency of an awareness of a network of nodes that creates a coherence of symbolic meaning, which is the relativistic representation of computation that creates the multifractal geometry, which I think that comes from the complex plane and becomes spacetime, which is just a reduction of the ultimate level of reality, which is infinity, which just has infinite potential. And then it becomes an illusion of something fixed. And that illusion always changes, which is time, which is computation. So time is computation. And I think physics is information. Every symmetry collapses under this paradigm because the highest point of equilibrium is a paradox. Even equilibrium itself, it doesn't make justice, because everything you're going to say is going to be a symmetry. There's always going to be two sides, because that's the nature of information. So the highest level has to be the awareness of the two different sides of the symmetry. So everything you speak about a subject is always going to be two sides, and the convergence of spacetime is going to be a reflection of the computation of the network that perceives the two sides, which creates the distinction, which creates multifractal geometry, which creates the illusion of the passage of time. Paradox of authority. Every time you use a library, so this is related to programming. Every time you use a library, it's like you're delegating your thinking to a third party, 3D, to a third party, and therefore run the risk of authority bias. Because what you're doing with the library is replacing the node there on the network with a library instead of an authority. Because a library itself is built based on assumptions of the people that created the library. So you're delegating responsibility to them in order to increase efficiency, and then they get control over you. And everyone is incentivized to do that to some degree, because otherwise you lose the race, which is the market economy, in order to gain control over the network, which is just the computation of what's going to be built, which is the cycle of technology and how it shapes the environment, which is a feedback loop system that is going to be based on the data that the network receives. So network receives binaries, which is data, then does the computation, creates technology, then shapes the space-time with the technology, and then that becomes the new data and becomes this vicious cycle. And this is the problem we have, because it's not scalable, because we are not accurate enough in the way that we converge into maximizing energy efficiency by creating tribalistic thinking. So it delegates you authority too much, and our empathy is not scalable. If you don't understand it from first principles when libraries break, your entire world collapses, because it's built on a house of cards. So if you always use libraries, and if you always learn syntax, which is the problem I talked about in the first place, is that you don't know what you don't know. If you learn from the surface level in the beginning, which is just searching for the simple keywords you find, like JavaScript or Python, or you learn React or things like that, what's going to happen is that you're going to create your entire tree there of knowledge based on authorities. So it's like you replace everything with an authority instead of having first principles. So this would become like here the base, and everything else would be on authority, because all that you're doing is just use simple concepts that people built through you and libraries, and then you don't understand anything at all. And then for some time this is going to work, because things might be stable, but then as soon as there is some variance, which there's always going to be variance on space-time because that's the nature of entropy. So as soon as you face variance, the one of the links is going to break, and then everything else is going to collapse after that because you don't have any fundamental understanding of what you're doing. So it's going to take you a lot more time to debug. And instead, if you spend all your time learning from first principles instead, then what's going to happen is that you also are not going to be very efficient because you're not fast enough. So you can't learn everything on your own. So there's always a balance. And the balance is going to be the multifactorial line that separates the notion of subjectivity with objectivity, which is the funnel of information. So in order to achieve equilibrium, the best thing to do is to learn from first principles, and then at the same time, make sure that you are using libraries or concepts that other people built every now and then to maximize your efficiency and your speed, but while being careful to have the, I think, fourth concept, which is awareness, which is the tool that allows you to self-reflect on the stuff that you learned, and it's going to make you gain more accuracy over time by slowly replacing points of authority bias that you created, or concept bias or library bias, to your own first principles thinking, which is going to be your relativistic reference frame of the scientific paradigm, which is a probabilistic worldview of the structure of knowledge and abstraction that creates your identity in space-time. The challenge of using AI as a teacher is clarifying the distinctions between fundamentals, first principles, and nuances, subjectivity, in a way where the challenges presented to the learners are designed in such a way that they navigate from nuance to first principles according to their current level of skill, the flow represented on the graph. So yeah, this is what I was talking about before, where the difference between these two different gradients here, the skill and the challenge, is going to determine the frequency of computation that the person does in order to go from subjectivity to objectivity, which is always relative. But you can imagine like their level of skill in the beginning is at the feelings level, which is very high variance, and there isn't anything concrete because they don't know anything. And the place that they're trying to go is the first principles, which is just condensing the information in space-time, the link between the past and the future. That's going to create the relativistic probability that the stuff that they're doing is reliable. So the whole process of learning is to create this funnel of information where you don't need to think about the subjectivity anymore because you compressed everything into a concept, which is always relative. And then at the moment you compress everything into a concept, then you know that thing. You know the subject. You become an expert. So the gradients of the two is going to determine like what kind of computation you need to do to bridge the gap between the two. So if you have a very low level of skill and a very high level of a challenge, then this has to be a lot higher here. Like you have to spend a lot more time here and less time here because you have more stuff to learn. But then as you learn, this changes. And now you spend, or maybe it's the other way around. Like, I think it's kind of hard to say here, but it's pretty much like, which is, I think, very intuitive. The less you know, the more you're going to spend on the subjective, which is the variance, and trying to search for authorities to understand like what can be true and what can't be true. And then you're going to fact check that based on your first principles from other domains. And then based on that, the more time you spend on the subject, the less time you're going to spend on the basic stuff, because then you're just solidifying the information in your body. So learning something is just downloading data into your biochemistry until you have enough that you are perceived by others to have a decent understanding of the subject. And the challenge with that is, when it comes to the AI teacher, is to understand like how do you draw this distinction, because the distinction between what's fundamental and what's nuance is this multifractal boundary here. At some point, you're going to close the gap, and you're going to pass the gap of the multifractal, and something that was perceived to you as being subjective is going to become objective, because you cross this boundary here. And the hardest part in learning is figuring out where the line is. which is the distinction between what's fundamental and what's not fundamental. Because in the beginning, you don't know what you don't know. And then there is a very high level of risk because there's a chance that you create the wrong pathways here towards the first principle. And if you do that, you're going to create a concept that is grounded in something that is likely to not be real, in relationship to the reference frame of your identity that is your current experience of space-time. So this has high risk and is difficult to do. So, and the way that most people do, and this is the challenge, the paradox of the search engine is that the way that most people are going to do it is that they're going to stay on the surface because that's what gets the most views, because everything's based on the market economy. So most content is going to be done for this part because, or for the part in the first principles here, like from the point of view of the person that is teaching, most of the content is going to be based on here, but there's not going to be a lot of complexity on the learning of the person that does it. So you can imagine, like from the point of view of the person that understands, they are they're teaching this concept from this point, but they have all this variance here that sustains this principle, which is, for example, I'm teaching the syntax on JavaScript, which is the first principle, but subconsciously I understand everything that is related to that syntax that builds the syntax in the first place, which is the subjectivity on the top here. But the person that is learning doesn't have any idea. So the person that is learning is going to take this first principle and they're going to put on this level on their map. So what's going to happen is that they get an understanding of what the syntax is, but it is not grounded in anything. So when the syntax breaks, they don't know what to do. And the reason why is because they don't understand the nuance, which is where the line is. And if you teach people from this approach, then it's very inefficient because they don't know what they're doing. But the challenge is, how do you take someone that doesn't know anything to this point where they have very good first principles? And the way that you do that is by gauging their level of skill, which is going to determine the frequency from which they go to the subjectivity, to the objectivity, through computation, and by giving them challenges that are directly correlated with their level of skill. That's going to help them bridge the gap in a way that makes sense. And this whole flow of information has to be grounded into a high density structure, high density probability. So the easier it is to do something because it's more established, like building a form in a website, the easier it's going to be to create this funnel here because the problem is well defined and there's a high probability that it's not going to change that much. So it's easier to get someone to learn the fundamentals of building a form than to learn something that is very specific, for example, microservices or something that scales, because that's going to have more subjectivity. So I think I would start from the stuff that is more objective first and then go to the stuff that is subjective and try to build something that closes the gap between, that allows people to understand not only like how to do something, but also the fundamental. And the way that you do that is by training the AI model based on the data. So in this case, you would train based on the form data. You take all the form from all the websites, all the possible ways you can do a form, which is all these possible challenges here. You train an AI based on that, and then you put people on a feedback loop system that is going to allow them to see if it was hard or not for them to understand. Based on this feedback loop system, you break down the concept even more until you are able to gain higher and higher levels of accuracy in the distinction between what is fundamental and what is always changing. So I think that's everything that I wanted to say. I think I'm going to come back today to think hopefully this is understandable. If you watch this and don't understand, just ask questions on the comments. I can try to make more videos. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, so I'm not really sure. It's very hard to keep everything in mind. Not sure if any of this is understandable, but hopefully it's helpful to someone out there. So yeah.